What is grief supposed to look like? Do you feel stuck? Do you feel like you're not doing it right? You have suffered a horrible, horrible loss. And now you want to know, when will this sadness, this grief ever end? There are a lot of people who talk about complicated grief. There are people who talk about the stages of grief, and they try to make it sound as though, one, it should be over in a brief amount of time, or a reasonable amount of time, or two, it's so complicated you'll never get past it. But I want to offer you a third solution, and that will come in the form of the Pinball grief model. So before I get into this, I just want you to please hit like and subscribe and help me out there with my channel, and I will get into that and into this grief model. Several years ago, I published a paper that was on what I called the Buyer Pinball grief model. And I used to tell my students at Baylor University that one of these days you're going to see this in a textbook. I actually think I have a friend who's working on a textbook with someone else, and she wants to include it in the chapter on grief. But anyway, be that as it may, I want to show that to you. I'm going to pull up a picture of it real quick, and I'm going to try to give you, this is the grief model. I know it's kind of hard to see, and I will include a link below, and I'll try to give you some pictures of this that are a little bit easier to read. But what I did was I kept thinking about working with my clients, how difficult it was for them to get through grief. And I realized that grieving is a normal process. Everybody knows that. We think of it as something that we're supposed to go through in stages, because a long time ago, I think it was in the late 60s, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross gave us what she called the 5 stages of grief. And those stages, almost everyone recognizes. They're referenced quite frequently. The stages are shock, denial, bargaining, anger, depression, and then finally acceptance. The problem is, with the stage model, it implies that you're going to go through those stages in a linear fashion. You're going to do one, then you'll move on to the next, and then you'll move on to the next. And another problem with this is that once you get to acceptance, you're done. And that was the way that model was presented to me years ago when I was going through my own grieving process. And I was really angered when someone suggested that I wasn't over it yet. That 18 months is, according to Kubler-Ross's program, her stage theory, 18 months is the amount of time it should take to get through this. There's one big problem, though. Kubler-Ross did her research on dying. Her book was written on death and dying. And so she was looking at people who had been diagnosed with a terminal illness. And so when she went through that, she met people who, when they first were diagnosed with their cancer or whatever was wrong with them, that they were in shock and they denied, no, nothing can be wrong with me. And they bargained with God, God, please help me get past this. They talked to the doctors trying to figure out how to get over it. But they've been told, you've got stage 4 cancer, you're going to die. And they struggle with that. And then they become angry. They become angry at God. They become angry at their doctors. They may become angry at themselves or their family members or other people. They become angry. And they're depressed. They are so sad that this has happened to them, that they have had this terrible thing happen in their life. And it some point they finally get to acceptance. And this is a fine model to understand how people who are dying get to that point where they accept their imminent death. But this doesn't describe the process for people who are still living. So at the end of a year and a half, when these people got to acceptance, they died. But when we get to a place where we think we're at acceptance, and then something happens and we are triggered again, and all of a sudden we are back in the shock and denial and the anger and the bargaining and the depression, and it just bounces all over the place. And it reminded me, when working with my clients, it reminded me of the old pinball machines. And when you'd send that ball up into the machine, it would bounce all over the place. It hit with that shock, and it'd go back and forth with, denial and then anger and depression. It was just all over the place. And about the time you got down to where that little ball was heading toward acceptance, those little flappers at acceptance sent that ball back up. That there's something that happens to keep us stuck in this. Now, I had a difficult time getting this paper published because the thought process in America has been, well, these people are struggling with complicated grief. And complicated grief is where they get stuck. And that, I'm not saying that that's not true. Different people grieve in different ways. My objection to that model is that it makes it sound as though there's something wrong with you if you are stuck and if you can't get through it, or if years later you are still saddened by the loss of a child or by the death of someone that you love very dearly, or by the loss of a job or the loss of a career. That those things do come back up. There are things that help us to remember that. And I don't see that as being a problem with your ability to process. I see that as being normal. And so that's why I created the Buyer Pinball grief model, to normalize this experience of being all over the place and not having any kind of ability to control it. When you are in it, you are in it. Now, the problem with and then also with the pinball, you have the stronger the event, the more critical of the event, the more hurtful the event, the more action you get on that ball. That ball represents this event that has been shot up into the machine. And the more action you have on that ball, the more it bangs around, the longer it stays up in the game, the pinball machine. And while it's up there, it's racking up points. There are more and more points, and you get more and more balls to play with. Now, again, I was criticized for this model because grief isn't a game, and I never intended it to be considered a game. But in a very real way, it's, life isn't a game, but we talk about the game of life. It's not a game. This isn't fun, but it is what happens. The more critical the event, the more points are scored, the more balls, the more opportunities there are for more triggering events to happen. If you lose a child to death, and every year you're going to remember that death, you're going to remember their birth date, you're going to remember their death date, you will miss them at every holiday event. Those things never, ever go away. It never gets to the point where you say, it happens. No, we get to some point of acceptance, but then that's only acceptance in the moment, and then it sends us back up. Something happens, a memory happens, we see a picture, we have a thought that sends us back up into that, and we have to go through that process all over again. Now, quite frankly, the first few times that this happens, when you're in the thick of it, when it's very fresh, very new, it's going to happen a lot more frequently, and it's going to be a lot harder to get to that place of temporary acceptance. But it never goes away. It gets easier each time. There isn't as much action on the ball as there was before, but that grief is going to come back. And I want to normalize that for people. I don't want people to think that there's something wrong with them because they are still grieving 20 or 30 years later, or even longer. I know people who lost children in birth, who lost children in a miscarriage, who are still grieving 50 years later. This happens. It is not an abnormal way to process. They will always be sad, and that's okay. Please don't let contemporary psychology tell you that there's something wrong with you because you are still sad, because you are still grieving the loss of a loved one. Remember, grief is a normal process that we all experience, and the way you grieve is unique to you, and no one can tell you how to do it. Only you know how you feel. Only you can experience this. If you found this video helpful, please hit like and subscribe, and check me out on some of the others that I have on this topic, as well as building better relationships.